Greetings and salutations, everyone. I hope everyone is still doing well, and welcome to today's bonus upload. Before we jump into it, a couple quick links. As many of you know, I rely on Patreon, PayPal, channel membership, and the merch to help the channel to continue to grow and go. Links to Patreon, PayPal, and channel membership is in the description below. Merch displayed directly under the video. Also, Dogman Frightening Encounters, Volume 1 through 3, the audiobook versions. They were written and researched by Tom Lyons, narrated and produced by me, Jeff Nadolny. Those audiobooks are available on Audible, Amazon, and iTunes, links to which are also in the description as well. And finally, last but definitely not least, if you'd really like to help support this channel to continue to grow and go, simply subscribe. It does not cost a cent. Click that like button, takes half a second. If you don't want to miss out on any of the informative uploads that I put out daily, click the bell icon, and folks, please leave a comment and share the video. Why? Well, because all these things really do help this channel to continue to grow and go. They are appreciated and they do matter. Now, everyone, I have taken far too much of your time. Let's jump in to today's bonus upload, shall we? Today's first encounter. My great-grandmother owned 28 acres in rural Kentucky. She left 14 acres to my Aunt R and 14 to my Gram. My Gram left her land and her home to myself and my husband. My experience actually happened before my husband and I ever met. About 8 years ago, I was in the woods behind our house with my ex-boyfriend and my friend. We were exploring and just really hanging out. Sometime during our escapade, I split from them and went off on my own. I know my land pretty well as I grew up here, so I headed for a clearing I thought would be kind of nice to relax in. The clearing in question is pretty close to the edge of the woods, and you can even make out the back of my barn if you look hard enough. When I cleared the trees, I immediately felt like I was being watched. It was so sudden and so intense, I stopped in my tracks immediately. Some part of my mind was in control, but it didn't feel like me, if that makes sense. The part that was in control told me to turn around, so I faced the way that I came. Slowly, and not to make a sound. When I turned, I didn't see anything right away. Just the forest that I had come out of. And what looked like a downed tree off to the left, but my head told me to move slowly out of the woods. In order to do that, I'd have to pass the downed tree, as the path out of the woods runs that way. For some reason, I really didn't want to do this. My body started moving for me, and I made my way down the path towards the tree, keeping my eye on it, but the closer I got to it, the less tree-like it looked. Finally, I was in front of it about 10 feet away. It was not a tree. It was an impossibly large wolf-like creature, and it was staring right at me. It was lying down with its head on its paws, and it was really just massive. I wanted to scream and run, but my mind would not let me. It told me to be as quiet and slow as I could. I stared that thing down for what felt like 30 minutes, but in reality was 30 seconds. Even still, I got a great look at it. It was dark brown, as big as a black bear, and really still its eyes followed me as I moved, but that was all that moved. I know it wasn't a bear, because I know the difference between a bear and a canine. I cleared the woods and immediately ran for my house, screaming for my ex and my friend. Weirdly enough, I didn't tell them about what I saw, and didn't even want to. Not because it sounds crazy, but because I just didn't think I should. 5 years later or so, I was hanging out with my cousin, and I had the sudden urge to tell her what happened. She grew up around these woods as well, so she knows where the clearing is. I thought she wouldn't believe me, but the hairs on the back of her neck stood straight up while I was explaining the thing, and I knew at that point she had seen it as well. She told me that when she was young, she was playing down by the barn with her siblings, my other cousin, and my aunt had called them for dinner. My other cousins went up to my aunt's house, but my cousin stayed and played. She was throwing rocks at the trees when she saw the same wolf coming running out of the woods at her. She said it was fast enough to get from the wood line to the barn, about 200 feet by the time she had got to the orchard, which is 20 feet from the barn. She ran to my aunt's house and never breathed a word about what she had seen. The older she got, the more convinced she became that it was just a dream. I haven't been back to that clearing since that day, and my cousin's story explains why I've never saw her go into the woods when I was younger. My sister hates it here because she claims she feels like she's being watched. Everyone but me thinks she's ridiculous. My cousin theorized that it's a type of guardian spirit. It was angry with her for throwing rocks at the trees, and that's why it was aggressive with her. It didn't attack or chase me because I wasn't harming anything. I'm not sure, but it's the best explanation we have, as no one but us knows about it. I'm sharing this encounter for the first time, honestly, just so maybe someone could tell me what it was. The weirdest thing of all is that my cousin swears she remembers it having large, purple-colored eyes that burned into her, but I don't remember what the eyes looked like. I stared into those eyes for 30 seconds, and to this day can't remember what they looked like, only that they followed my movements. I apologize if this is sort of scattered or in wrong format. I just wanted to share my experience and hopefully gain some insight. Also, I was 100% sober that day. I don't have a history of hallucinations or delusions. In fact, I rated high for logical thinking and rational thought when I was evaluated. Today's second encounter takes place in upstate New York, and you know I had to share it. For some background, me and my buddy bought a bus from Facebook Marketplace, and we went to the buyer's property, which is way out in the boonies, in order to work on it and get it working while we still had daylight. It turned out that the bus was really rusted on some of the parts we needed fixed, and we needed professional work, so we called our buddy to come pick us up and began walking down the road to meet him, at least a few minutes early. The drive is about an hour from our home. During our walk down the dark country road, we passed by a house with a large yard, and hear this strange yelping that I can only describe as a mixture of a dog barking and a human screaming. At first we thought it was nothing, and just thought it was some weird animal or someone screwing with us. However, after the yelping sound, we couldn't shake the feeling like we were being watched, as well as hearing twigs snapping to our right in the woods. We kept walking till we reached the streetlight and stopped for a minute, and while we were in the light, the feeling of being watched was heavily diminished, and the twigs snapping disappeared. After a bit, we decided to keep walking, and the feeling of being watched came back. We kept walking and checking behind us, and eventually we came across a field with knee-high grass, and we could hear the yelping again, before suddenly the grass next to us started shaking violently, as though something was coming towards us. Both me and my buddy stopped and stared at the spot, before we started shouting at it in deep voices, which seemed to confuse or stop the thing. After a short time of nothing coming out at us, we kept walking, but looking over our shoulders before we reached a crossroad where our friend met up with us and picked us up. We never laid eyes on the thing, and both me and my buddy are fairly avid outdoorsmen. It didn't sound like any animal I had ever heard, and whatever it was stalking us. Today's third encounter. I was around 14 years old when this took place. We had just moved to my grandmother's neighborhood like 3 weeks prior. I was extremely familiar with this place, as I had visited every weekend. Down the road a bit was a small pond that was in the middle of the next neighborhood over. I would regularly go down there and fish, as my dad owned property on the pond. He had a very nice house with a little gazebo that protruded out into the water a little bit. He lived right near a small dam at the end of this lake. The dam was about 8 feet high, and on the side that wasn't facing the lake, there was a 50-foot concrete slope that went into the woods below. It was a Friday night in January, and me being a fisherman I was getting ready for a trip down there the next morning. I went to bed kind of early with my dog, my fishing buddy Angel. She's a Jack Russell Terrier, Rat Terrier mix. I'd had her since I was 6, man's best friend for sure. Once we got in bed, I couldn't sleep for some reason. I just tossed and turned. Finally dozed off for about an hour, but woke up for no apparent reason and couldn't go back to sleep. I looked at my phone and it was about 1 in the morning, maybe 1:30. I decided I'd just go down to the pond and start fishing. I grabbed my fishing pole, tackle box, thermos, and Angel's leash, and we started walking down. You might think I'm crazy for going fishing in 20-degree weather, but I was really into fishing. Besides, I was having great luck fishing down there at night recently, so I wanted to push my luck. It was a short walk to get to the lake, but I had to walk around the far side of where I'd fished, which was about a half a mile or so. It was foggy that night, but I could still see pretty well because it was full or almost a full moon. It was extremely quiet as well. Usually the road I was on was very busy at all hours, but it was too cold for anyone to be out, I guess. We made it to my dad's friend's house and we walked down to the gazebo. I set my things down and take a drink of hot chocolate before I start getting my line ready for the water. Angel found a small place in between a wooden bench to lie down. Now, this next bit may seem unimportant, but just bear with me. Once I got my fishing pole rigged up, I cast it out and sat down and waited for a bite. My fishing reel has a setting where if a fish rugs on the line, it makes a loud clicking noise to let you know you have a bite. That's the setting I put it on. I sit down and look around. It was about 2:30 at this point. I look over to the left at the houses. I look over to the right toward the dam, which was about 40 feet from where I was. It's still really quiet, and I continued to look around the area, just taking in the moonlit water. Then suddenly I see something out of the corner of my eye. There, by the dam, I see a white blob walking on all fours, looking as if it was smelling the ground. It looked like a white dog from where I was, and I didn't want Angel to see it, so I picked her up and kept an eye on the thing. At this point, I still thought it was a dog, and I wasn't scared in the least bit. But then, as it made its way to the wall of the dam, it stood up on 2 legs, and I realized this was no dog. I crouched down beside the wooden bench where Angel was lying, grabbed her up, and faced her away from the creature. The thing didn't see me, and I was going to do my damnedest to make sure it didn't. I intensely watched it as it looked around the area. Then it proceeded to jump up onto an 8-foot dam effortlessly, almost as if it floated. Then it did something strange. Its pale white skin started to glow almost like a firefly. I could see bluish-colored veins in its back and calf muscles, and this thoroughly freaked me out. Then it turned around to where I could see its face. It was about 3.5 feet tall. It had a short torso, long skinny legs and arms, a wide head, almost oval-shaped, large ears, a large mouth, with many small teeth, and huge eyes that were yellowish-orange in color. On top of that, it's glowing. I was nearly hyperventilating, trying to control my breathing, hoping this thing would not hear me. Angel was not aware of its presence, and the hair on her neck stood up as she started growling and struggling to get out of my arms. I kept watching it, terrified to move. It didn't do anything when it got to the top of the dam. It just squatted down and looked as though examining something in its hands. After a few moments of watching it, I worked up an idea to just go back the way I came, and once I got to the road, just run as fast as I could. Angel was growing increasingly aggressive in trying to see what was going on, but I kept her buried in my big winter jacket the best I could. I decided just to leave my stuff there and come back the next day and get it. I slowly stood up, and just as I was about to start walking away from the gazebo, my fishing pole started making that zing noise. Of all times now, I got a fish bite. My attention went straight to the creature, which was now frantically looking around for the source of the noise. In my panic, I forgot to keep Angel covered up, and she saw the creature for the first time. She started barking like I had never heard her bark before, as if she was in terror or something, and that scared me. The creature then saw us, and it bent down as if it were about to start running toward us. I tried to take a step back and start running, but I slipped on the cold, hard ground and landed on my side and looked at the creature. Thankfully, it hadn't started to chase us, but it let out the most disturbing scream I had ever heard. It sounded like a woman screaming, but backwards, if that makes sense. It then jumped from the dam into the woods about 100 feet away and faded as it landed. I was in tears, and my fight kicked in. I grabbed down Angel and ran as fast as I could all the way back to my house, too afraid to look back and see if it was behind me. I got home and didn't really remember what had happened till the next day. I must have passed out. I remember it seeming like a dream, but the next day I went to get my gear from the gazebo and it was still there. I did not go back to that pond, even during the day, for a few years. I told my mom and dad the story some months later, and while they believe me, I still wonder what that creature was. Today's fourth part of the upload. This is about a rather strange creature my grandmother told stories about since I was a child, and to this day she still swears it's true. They were never told with the intent to scare us, but rather I always got the notion that it was something she strongly believed and was simply offering us as a warning, even when I hear her retell it now, that I'm still in my 30s. The time frame would have been around 1900 to 1915 in southwestern Virginia, when all this started and continued up until the late 30s or early 40s after my grandmother was born. My grandmother lived with her grandparents at the time, and as a custom with the region, it was not uncommon that several relatives in a household on any given day. Their home was well back in the deep valley, or holler, as they like to call it. The stories always seemed to follow a similar sequence that supposedly happened countless times, and was seen by members of my family and even several neighbors. Sometimes during nights, when the moon was full and clear, they'd all be lying asleep, all in a small home with most of the beds in a single room, only to be awakened by something stomping on the roof like it was trying to shake the rafters loose. They'd hear it scratch and stomp around on the roof for several minutes before it would get very quiet, with even the local wildlife hushing up unnaturally. After a little while, they'd hear something thumping the kitchen table like it was dancing, and then the sounds of my grandmother's china cabinet slamming on the wall and the contents being thrown and broken all over the floor. When they rushed to see what it was, nothing would be amiss, and the room seemed perfectly normal, every dish in place. One night, she says, her grandfather and his brother had enough of this and sat up well into the night, shotguns in hand, with a clear moon shining, to catch this thing and kill it. Well, sometime after everyone was asleep and they were still up waiting, as expected, the roof began to heave violently and something jumped off and landed in the front yard, making a noise that she described sounding like a turkey gobbling, but if the turkey was possessed by the devil himself, and as big as a train car. She says it was so loud the house shook. Her grandfather rushed outside to confront it, and could hear its footfalls just feet ahead of him as he chased it down the trail into the woods. He swore that the moon was so bright he could have seen a rabbit in the weeds from yards away, but he never could see whatever he was chasing, even though he saw grass parting and limbs breaking as it ran ahead of him. He said he could even hear it breathing and screeching. Eventually it just vanished, and he was left standing in the dark, and the woods were so quiet you could hear a pin drop. It was a while before anything happened again, and the neighbors across the mountain had heard of this tale in the local community. One of their older sons came over to sit with her grandfather for a few nights to see this thing because he didn't believe a word of it. He was a very serious man and thought maybe her grandfather was suffering from a sickness of the mind. They put all the children to bed each night and sat up at the hearth into the morning with the other adults to wait to see if it would show. Bear in mind, up until this point, no one had laid eyes on this thing. It was the middle of summer, and they had the front door propped open to let the breeze in. The man was the only one facing the door as they were all sitting in chairs talking. And all of a sudden he got up and screamed like he had been shot and climbed over two women trying to get away from the door, even knocking them to the ground. Grandmother says he was a mild gentleman and very quiet, and she'd never seen anybody so scared. Grandmother says that he was a mild gentleman, very quiet, and she'd never seen anybody so scared. It was completely out of character for him. He was inconsolable and swore he saw it looking through the door into the home in the moonlight, but never would give a description, only saying that man never had words made to go with a thing like that. They moved out of that house some time after that and never did get any idea of what it was that was causing all the commotion. But several other folk in the area came forward to report similar events at their homes after her grandfather told his tale to the community. In those days, with people as clannish and private as folk in this area are, it's not surprising that they'd be reluctant to share something like this with their neighbors, a fear of being ridiculed at best and thought to be devil worshippers or cursed at the worst. I have researched quite a bit online and can't seem to find anything that matches this description. I would love to know if anyone else in the Appalachians have seen or heard something about this. It's such a strange story, but I know my grandmother is telling the truth when she tells the story. You can see her fear and hear it in her voice. Today's fifth encounter. We live in Northern Territory, Australia. Yesterday, my sister, 36, told me that she saw something in the yard. She lives rural on a huge block, and it was about 6:15 p.m. The sun was still up. She was cooking for her family. They were all outside still playing, and she doesn't know what made her look up, but in the brush, she saw a long-legged creature. Its knees were bent backwards. It was brown in color and almost like a hunchback. She described the skin as leather-looking. It ran to another brush, and she said it was so fast, she almost got the vibe that it was cheeky and was trying to play hide-and-seek with her. She didn't alert her family, but she suddenly found herself inside the house for absolutely no reason. She remembers walking inside, but was kind of like, why am I in here? As she turned and went back outside, the creature was gone at this point. She didn't see its face or its head, but said it was definitely taller than a grown man. Today's final encounter. In my younger days, just after high school, I was what most would consider a vagrant. No home to speak of, but not quite homeless either. Growing up poor in a poor, dying factory town assures a few things, but most of the kids in my town knew and understood clearly the only way to escape such a bleak place was to leave. Find work somewhere else, and don't come back unless you want to be trapped forever. And I was no exception to this understanding. It was the result of this desperate retreat for certain poverty that led me to work as a laborer in a pipeline industry. Grueling work, but decent pay. A fair start for one such as myself. After about 3 months of working, my foreman, who we'll call Jay, discovered I was staying at a motel and wouldn't have it. He was kind enough to invite me to stay with his family until I found an apartment, and I was grateful for his offer. Jay and his family were honest rural people who lived in an honest rural area. A house with a barn in a field surrounded by wooded hills. No neighbors. One road in, one road out. Very similar to the houses I had seen and been around growing up. It was a great area and a great company, and I was thankful for such a turn in my luck. The first evening I stayed there, Jay's wife got me situated in my room. I became acquainted with everyone in the house over dinner. After our meal, I stepped out for a cigarette and decided the tree line behind their barn would be the best place to smoke privately and inoffensively. The sun had set, and then, by the time I stepped out of the house, the moon was high and full, keeping the valley. I was in a dully illuminated and casting the surrounding hills as dark shadows against the starry-filled sky. A night that I think most would find peaceful. But as soon as my boots met the grass, that primal instinct warning that a man gets sometimes being slowly creeped into my core. That alarm that tells you something is not right. Being young and dumb and brave, of course, I shrugged it off and continued to the tree line, attempting to keep the growing feeling at bay. When I at last approached the shadowed tangle of trees and underbrush of the outskirts of their yard, I reached into my pocket and pulled out my pack of Marlboros and my matches and struck it aright. As I brought the match to my cigarette, I saw it. A few feet from where I was standing, just barely within the trees, was a stark and outstanding silhouette of something huge. It stood crouched and still had to be at least 7 feet tall, large pointed ears, and a narrow, elongated snout. Its eyes glimmered that weird infrared color you see when animals reflect light in their eyes at night. Oh my God, there's a wolf, that's a wolf, were my initial panic-stricken thoughts. It was in the middle of this process that I realized there was no way this was a wolf, because wolves don't stand upright, and this creature was unmistakably on 2 legs. It was crouched low, one arm hung down past its haunches, and the other was pressed firm against the tree to right itself. Broad shoulders and savage posture, it did not move. It didn't seem startled or threatened or afraid, but simply aware. It knew I saw it, and it knew I knew. I wish I could say I did something, anything. I wish I could say that I ran, or I screamed, or I even moved, but I was frozen in fear, standing rigid as a statue with nothing but a quickly dying matchlight between me and whatever monstrous thing this was. We locked gazes for what felt like hours, but was only a few seconds. And as though the creature had decided it was done terrifying me, it straightened up and backed away slowly into the darkness of the trees. No sound, not a broken twig or a rustling of a leaf to be heard. As soon as my legs allowed me to, I ran like hell back to the safety of Jay's house, slammed the door behind me, and was met with a look of concern from my foreman and his wife, who were watching TV in the living room. There's something out there. It was the only thing I could gasp. Jay exchanged a glance with his wife and looked back towards me. Boy, if you're going to stay here, you need to understand that there's things out in the woods that you best not pay attention to, he said, and so nonchalantly, like he was talking about last night's football game. You hear a strange noise and you ignore it. You see a strange shadow, you ignore it. And if you get a strange feeling, you come inside and forget about it. There are things out there we just don't understand, but we respect, because it's their land. We just live here. It's been 15 years since my encounter with that creature in the woods, and I still think about it often. And though I stayed with Jay and his family for another 3 weeks after that night, I never felt easy on his property. That feeling never left. That warning stayed alert. And I will never go out to the woods at night unless I have absolutely no choice. Once you know what's out there, you never see things the same again. I know this may seem far-fetched, and I know that many won't believe what I'm saying. But my encounter is 100% true. And there you have it, folks, today's bonus. I do hope you all enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed sharing it with you. I'd like to thank you all for supporting the channel. It is, after all, your support that keeps this channel growing and going, and what gives us all a place and a chance to share our experiences and theories judgment-free. Everyone is simply treated with the respect that we deserve. Please stay safe, happy, healthy, and ever vigilant, keeping an eye on our children, pets, family, and friends. These creatures are real. These events have happened. Share this information with those you love and care about, and it may just help save their lives someday. Until next time, never stop asking questions, never stop searching for the truth, and God bless you all.